that's the thing about being a reporter. All this thing of objectivity, this is all crap. What journalists do is manipulate facts. That's what I did for a living.
Did you do that? You did that?
Yes, of course, we all do. The difference is between those of us who cared about the truth and those of us who cared about news, and it's not the same thing. And if you care about the truth, eventually you're going to run into problems.
Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, activist, and best-selling author who spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent. 15 of those years he spent covering some of the most dangerous conflict zones in the world for the New York Times. As a vocal anti-capitalist, he's been a polarizing figure in the mainstream media, which doesn't really matter to him because he thinks mainstream media is full of shit.
Listen, don't take this the wrong way, but you sound like a left-wing nutbar.
If you want to discuss issues, that's fine, but, this sounds like Fox News, and I don't go on Fox News.
In his new book, Wages of Rebellion, Chris looks at how revolution has changed countries and society since the 17th century, and argues that America is next. He recently dropped by our New Vice office in Toronto to talk about why America is on the edge of revolt, and how that's maybe not such a bad thing.
So you're someone who's been shot at by drunk snipers. You've seen death squads in El Salvador. Seen some pretty dark shit. Do you think that overly informs the way you look at the world?
I wouldn't say overly. I would say that I understand the dark side of human nature because of it. I know what human beings are capable of. I also know how societies disintegrate. I've seen them go down. It's not theoretical for me. So I look around. Because I covered the war in Yugoslavia, I can be in a supermarket and suddenly remember what it looked like when all the windows were smashed out and the shelves were empty and there was no electricity. And I think that's an asset because most people are unable to see the fragility of the structures around them and how easily they can collapse. I think people have lost faith across the political spectrum in neoliberalism. They're not buying it. Everything that neoliberalism and globalization supposedly was going to bring us is a lie. It has concentrated wealth into the hands of a global corporate oligarchic elite. It has pushed down wages. It has created chronic unemployment and underemployment. It has eviscerated the middle class. And it has not been a force, as it claims, for democratization. In fact, the opposite. It has been a force that has destroyed civil liberties. The lie is harder and harder to sustain because it's more palpable in the physical conditions around us. You drive through city after city in America, and it's just wasteland after wasteland. Our infrastructure is falling apart. We lie about unemployment figures. I think the LA Times a year or two ago ran a story saying real unemployment is probably about 17%. But even then, half of America, by official statistics, lives in poverty. That's 40,000 per household, which most economists argue is an unrealistic dividing line. But then you add the category of near poverty, which is another. You're pushing 2/3 of the country. Look, in the United States, we are seeing a rise of very frightening nihilistic violence. School shootings. I think we've had 26 law enforcement officials assassinated. Now, I'm not talking about like gun battles. I'm talking about assassinations.
Guys walking up with guns, shooting them while they're parking their cars.
And these are very disturbing signs. And they are examples of people who, some of them obviously are psychotic and there are mental issues, but people are breaking down. You should read, Chomsky points this out, and he's right. Read Stacks. This is the guy who flew his Cessna into the IRS building in Austin, Texas. But you should read his manifesto, where he talks about living in a rundown project, everybody's eating dog food. That's real. And this kind of mania for hope that has infected even the left is a political pacifier. Everybody is kind of addicted to these happy thoughts. And that keeps us complacent.
So I've been reading Wages of Rebellion. I wanted to ask you, do you think a revolution could happen in North America?
Well, I hope so. It's all we have left. I think when you look at all of the ingredients that go into creating revolt, the ingredients are there. We are going to have to destroy the system of corporate power by non-cooperation, by obstruction, and by refusing to be fooled by these very clever political carnivals, Canada having just finished one, that cough up these ineffectual figures that are going to do nothing to reverse C-51, which is the very draconian security and surveillance bill, in some ways worse than the Patriot Act. You've got the tar sands. I mean, the Liberal Party's not going to touch that. In the same way that Obama didn't touch security. It's up to us, and it means acts of sustained civil disobedience. We have a moral imperative to stand up, if not for ourselves, for those who come after. That one revolts finally not for what they can achieve, but for who it allows them to become. And that we can't use the word hope if we don't revolt. If we remain passive, then we are accepting the death sentence that's being handed to us by these corporate forces. There is no way in the American political system to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. You can't do it. And so that creates governmental paralysis, the inability on the part of the government to do anything but serve the needs of a tiny cabal, in this case, a corporate cabal.
In other words, people feel like the game is fixed.
But it is fixed. And it's not like they feel like the game is fixed, that they're beginning to know the game is fixed. And once they know the game is fixed, it becomes very dangerous. There are a lot of myths about revolution. They're driven by what Bakunin calls déclassé intellectuals, which is what the Occupy movement was. Highly educated white sons and daughters of the middle class who began to experience what people of color have been experiencing for decades. Unemployment, police repression, foreclosure, all that kind of stuff. And that's why the Occupy movement was an important and a seminal moment in modern history, because it, for the first time, fused those déclassé intellectuals with the underclass. I can only speak about Zuccotti, where I spent a fair bit of time. They lost control of the park. Once they put up individual tents, that's when you began sexual assaults came in, drugs came in. We have to remember they were heavily infiltrated.
By the government?
Oh, yeah. Heavily infiltrated.
You think FBI, CIA?
Completely. That's not even a question. Yeah. So, I mean, we have pictures of a few blocks away from Zuccotti, people dressed totally in black as Black Bloc getting out of the back of police vans. I mean, Occupy isn't over. It isn't over because because the state didn't respond rationally to the Occupy encampments. I mean, they closed it down by force. And a rational response would have been a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossession, and a rational healthcare system that isn't, allowing for-profit corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupted themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. That would have been rational. They didn't respond rationally, which means that they're going to get blowback. I mean, people forget Rosa Parks got on that bus in 54. You didn't get the next freedom rides till 61. If the state doesn't respond, and it's not responding, then this movement's going to continue. Revolt will continue. But it's always the state that determines the configurations of revolt. And the longer the state refuses to respond in a meaningful way, and the state is not responding, then they're going to get blowback. It's inevitable. There's a passage in Kissinger's memoirs, and no one should ever buy the book, where it's, I think, 1971, and there are tens of thousands of anti-war protesters surrounding the White House, which is what we have to get back to. And Nixon has taken empty city buses end to end and put them all around the White House to protect the White House. And he's looking out the window, wringing his hands, going, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's exactly where we want all people in power to be. That's our goal.
What would you tell young people who are disenfranchised? What advice can you give them?
Well, I wouldn't give them much advice. I've learned more from a lot of these movements than I've given to them. My focus is delineating power and how it works and why we can't trust it and why They get all that because they're victims of it. And you see with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter, the traditional black elite, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, come to Ferguson, they're booed out of the city, same in Baltimore. They get it. They're not buying Obama. And I teach in a prison. I teach, and boy, you walk in that prison, and these prisoners, they understand the system. No, we're going to have to, if we look for hope, it's going to be Idle No More, this great Indigenous First Nations movement in Canada, Quebec students movement. You know, there's a picture of me going off to get arrested at Goldman Sachs, and I've long given up trying to look hip. So I'm dressed kind of like this. I think it was a tweed jacket. And I'm surrounded by all these people who are like pierced and tattooed, and boy, that's where I get my energy from. I think they're wonderful. So I don't think I have a lot to teach. I mean, I do in terms of, I think, explaining power and how it works and the breakdown of power. But in terms of what we need to do, in terms of the mechanics of revolt, you know, I've certainly found among Black Lives Matter and among all of these groups a kind of really amazing creativity, political consciousness, sense of innovation, maturity. Yeah, I learn as much from them as I give to them.
You know, if I'm the government and I know who Chris Hedges is, I'm probably thinking that you're not quite my friend. You might be an enemy to my interests. Do you think sometimes that you've been spied on by NSA or FBI?
I mean, I know they watch me because I've been stopped at airports and asked obnoxious questions, and at one point not allowed into the United States for an hour or two at Newark. And but it's just, I think it's more like they're just kind of dicking with you. They're just trying to show you.
Yeah, they do that. That's happened to me before, actually.
They're just trying to say.
You get the quadruple S. And
well, you know what happens is I get there and I see the face of the Homeland Security change. I mean, I don't look dangerous.
Yeah.
But I can see their face change, and oftentimes they get like really kind of caustic and rude. And I think the people they're really scared of are the hackers. I don't think. The people who really frighten them are the hackers. Because the hackers, I mean, we have to back up. So when you have wholesale surveillance, you can't have investigative journalism. Because when somebody inside the systems of power reaches out to a journalist to talk about fraud, criminal activity, malfeasance, lies of the government, they're instantly traceable. That's why Snowden fled. Traditional investigative journalists who once the role of investigative journalism is to shine a light on these inner workings of darkness, whether in the government or anywhere else, and expose this to the public. And that's, you know, very important to the health of a democracy. That's gone. I mean, government officials are just too terrified to speak. So the hackers are the last group. Jeremy Hammond, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, of course, the people with the ability to break down those walls and give us information about war crimes, for instance, in the case of Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks.
How do you feel about the mainstream media? I mean, if you think that all these corporate powers are always in play, I mean, is anything sacred anymore?
So the mainstream media, what happened is so Clinton deregulates the FCC. That allows Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, they seize, about a half dozen corporations seize the airwaves. So this shrinks the parameters of acceptable debate, first of all. And you saw it like over Syria. What's the debate on Syria? Well, should we just bomb them, or should we bomb them and put boots on the ground, as if that's the debate? It's what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. So the electronic media gets bought up by these large corporations. Now, it's not like the old Hearst newspaper empire, which were media conglomerates. Media is just one revenue stream, perhaps out of hundreds of revenue streams, and they have to compete against those revenue streams. So it's all about money, ratings and money, basically, and they'll do anything for it. So I think the corporate media has now been so eviscerated that I would argue, at least on the commercial networks, they're not interested and don't do journalism anymore.
Well, what do you make of these new media companies? Like, what do you make of Vice? What do you think?
I think that they play the kind of role that has always been played in journalism, which is that so-called alternative media, which I would argue does far more real journalism than the established commercial media, pressures the mainstream media to do their job. That's always been the case. That's why the CBC in Canada or the BBC in Britain or public television and public radio in the States, which has been destroyed, is so important, because you should have a place in your society for people who are not beholden to business interests, corporate power, and the elites. And that's why they destroy those mechanisms. I mean, you go back to the 60s, we used to see Noam Chomsky on public TV. And we need those voices. You need those. It's hard, because if you really challenge dominant power is not going to invest in your operation.
And then maybe eventually they'll start coming to us with information they want us to disperse.
Well, what happens, and I think you even see it a little bit with Vice, I mean, as you reach an audience and tell a story that the commercial media is not telling, then the power elite comes to you and says, oh, why don't you come to the White House? They did with my friend Mark Maron. I love Mark. But and then you kind of get addicted to that access, and you kind of like it, and it kills you. So, I mean, basically your rule of thumb wants to be is, if everybody in power doesn't dislike you, you're probably not doing your job.
So that's a good piece of unsolicited advice
there you
from
go.
Chris Hedges.
That's right. Anarchist. That's the anarchist in me.